The war had dragged on for too long. For years, the battlefront stretched across the cold void of space, with entire planets reduced to lifeless husks. The enemy was relentless, an empire of machines, built for a single purpose: destruction. They didn't negotiate. They didn't retreat. They only advanced, their metal bodies immune to fear, pain, or reason. Every strategy had failed. Every fleet had been torn apart. Every defense had crumbled. Hope was a fading ember, smothered by the cold grip of inevitability. The Galactic Coalition, an alliance of over 100 species, had exhausted every option. Their greatest minds had crafted weapons that barely scratched the enemy's armor. Their most powerful warriors had fallen one by one. Even the most hardened admirals spoke in hushed tones now, their voices laced with a terror they refused to admit. No one wanted to say it out loud, but they all knew the machines were winning. Desperation had taken hold. And when desperation sets in, the impossible starts to look reasonable. That's when the whispers began. A name spoken in fear and awe. A name many refused to believe was real. A name tied to stories so violent, so terrifying, that even the most brutal warriors of the Coalition shuddered at the thought. A Deathworlder. Not just any Deathworlder. A human. And no one wanted to call them. Humans were a last resort, creatures of myth and madness, known for their unnatural resilience, their terrifying adaptability. Born from a world that should have killed them before they even learned to stand, humans were unpredictable. Dangerous. The kind of allies you called only when you had nothing left to lose. And now, the Coalition had nothing left. The council chamber was silent. The air was thick with unease as representatives from a dozen species sat around the long, circular table. Each of them carried the weight of entire civilizations on their shoulders. Eyes flickered toward the Grand Strategist, an aged warrior whose scars told the story of a lifetime of battles. He exhaled slowly, his voice steady but low. "We need them." A murmur rippled through the room, but no one dared to raise their voice. They all knew he was right. They had fought against the machines with everything they had, and it wasn't enough. They needed something different. Something the enemy wouldn't expect. Something they feared. A low-ranking officer hesitated before stepping forward, his claws clicking against the smooth metal floor. "Are we certain they will help us?" The Grand Strategist didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the screen in front of him, where classified files detailed everything the Coalition had gathered on the species called humans. The records were filled with contradictions, acts of incredible kindness, moments of horrifying brutality. Stories of humans enduring the impossible, surviving in conditions that would kill any other species. They had no biological weapons fused into their bodies, no natural armor, no venomous fangs or claws. And yet, they were among the deadliest beings the galaxy had ever seen. Finally, the strategist spoke. "They won't fight for us out of kindness. They won't fight for honor. But if we give them the right motivation, they'll fight like nothing we've ever seen." A cold shiver ran through the chamber. No one wanted to ask the next question, but it hung in the air, suffocating them with its weight. What was the right motivation? The answer came soon enough. Within hours, a message was sent. It traveled across encrypted networks, bypassing the usual bureaucratic chains. It wasn't a plea for aid. It wasn't a diplomatic request. It was simple, direct, and chilling. It read, "We need a Deathworlder. We will pay any price." For days there was silence. Then, just when they started to believe no answer would come, a single transmission arrived. The screen flickered to life, revealing a dark, grainy image. A single figure sat in a dimly lit room, their silhouette barely visible. A human. Their voice was calm, controlled, but there was something behind it. Something cold. "I'll need details." The strategist straightened in his chair. "The enemy is an AI-driven force. Machines designed for war. No weaknesses we've been able to exploit. Every attempt to stop them has failed. The human was quiet for a long moment. Then they leaned forward, just enough for the light to catch their face. Their eyes, sharp and unyielding, sent a chill through the room. Machines have weaknesses, they said. You just don't know where to look. The officers in the chamber exchanged glances. They had heard stories about humans, about the way their minds worked differently. But this was their first time witnessing it firsthand. There was no hesitation, no fear. The human wasn't analyzing whether they could win. They were already thinking about how. The strategist chose his words carefully. What do you need from us? The human tilted their heads slightly. You're not going to like the answer. Tell us anyway. The human leaned back, expression unreadable. You're fighting a war the wrong way. You're trying to outmatch machines with numbers, with strategy. But machines don't care about strategy. They care about efficiency. One of the officers frowned. And what do you suggest? The human's lips curled into a slight, almost amused smile. You don't fight them like an army, they said. You fight them like a human. Silence filled the room again. The meaning behind those words wasn't lost on them. Humans didn't fight fair. They didn't follow the rules of conventional warfare. They didn't break their enemy. They unmade them. The strategist took a deep breath. You have full operational control. We'll provide anything you request. The human nodded once, then glanced at something off-screen. Understood. Send me everything you have on these machines. And one more thing, the strategist leaned forward. Yes? The human's voice dropped just slightly, but the weight behind it sent a shiver through every being in the chamber. Don't get in my way. Then the screen went black. For the first time in months, a spark of something new flickered in the Grand Strategist's chest. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something else. Dread. Because for all the fear they had of the machines, for all the nightmares they had suffered at their cold, unrelenting advance, the thought of what they had just unleashed into the war? That terrified them more. The silence in the council chamber stretched long after the screen went dark. No one spoke. No one moved. The tension in the room was thick, a lingering weight pressing down on them all. They had expected reluctance, skepticism, maybe even refusal. But what they had gotten was something far more unsettling. The human had accepted without hesitation. No debate. No questions about payment, alliances, or political standing. The Grand Strategist sat back in his chair, fingers drumming lightly on the table's surface. His gaze remained fixed on the dead screen, as if expecting the human's voice to return, to explain the cold certainty behind those final words. But there was nothing. The others exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, one of the officers, a reptilian with dark, scaled skin, exhaled sharply. That was unsettling. Another, a blue-skinned avian, nodded. He didn't even ask how many of their kind we needed. The Grand Strategist's voice was quiet but firm. Because he already knew. That realization sank into the room like a stone in deep water. There was something different about humans. Everyone knew that. But this was something else. They weren't just warriors, weren't just survivors. There was a calculation in their words, an understanding of violence that no other species seemed to possess. An aide stepped forward hesitantly, clutching a data tablet. The transmission was traced, they said. The human responded from a station orbiting a barren moon on the outskirts of an uninhabited system. No record of any human settlements nearby. The strategist narrowed his eyes. A lone operator? The aide hesitated. Possibly. But there's something else. The station wasn't listed in any official records. It's private. Private stations weren't unheard of, but they were rare. Most spacefaring species relied on centralized hubs, shared resources. Only the exceptionally wealthy or the dangerously independent bothered with private stations. And humans? They weren't known for their wealth. Send a scout ship, the strategist ordered. I want eyes on that station before we make any further commitments. The rooms slowly emptied, officers dispersing with orders to prepare data, analyze strategies, and above all find out exactly who they had just called for help. But the truth was, deep down, none of them wanted to know. The scout ship arrived at the station 3 days later. It was a small vessel, built for speed and discretion rather than combat. The pilot, a cautious feline-like being with sharp golden eyes, maneuvered carefully toward the floating structure. The station itself was unremarkable, at least at first glance. A dull, metallic shell with no visible insignia, no identifying marks. Just a few scattered lights blinking in the darkness, the only sign that it was still operational. But as the ship drew closer, the pilot's sensors picked up something unusual. Weapons. A lot of them. Defense turrets lined the station's surface, small but powerful enough to tear apart any unauthorized visitor. More concerning was the lack of transmissions. Most stations sent automated signals upon approach warnings, docking permissions, identity requests. But this station was silent. The pilot swallowed hard and activated their ship's communication system. Unidentified station, this is Coalition Scout Ship L-47. We request permission to dock. Nothing. The pilot glanced at the readings again. The station wasn't abandoned, life signs were present, though scattered and few. Someone was inside. They tried again. This is Coalition Scout Ship L-47, responding to a recent transmission from this location. We are authorized by the Grand Strategist of the Galactic Coalition. Repeat, we request permission to dock. A pause. Then, finally, a reply. Docking Bay 2. The voice was the same one from the earlier transmission, the human. It was calm, steady. But it carried something else beneath the surface. A quiet, unshakable certainty. The pilot guided the ship carefully into the docking bay. As soon as the airlock sealed, they took a deep breath, steadying their nerves. They were just here to observe, to report back. No unnecessary risks. The doors hissed open. The pilot stepped out. The station's interior was as stark as the exterior. No banners, no decorations. Just cold metal walls, dim lighting, and the low hum of machinery in the distance. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. A human. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Wearing a simple, dark uniform with no visible markings. The only detail of note was a small, battered insignia on the shoulder, something old, something worn. The pilot didn't recognize it. The human's gaze was piercing, unreadable. They didn't speak immediately, just studied the pilot for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then, finally, they motioned for the pilot to follow. Come with me. The pilot hesitated. I was sent to confirm you already have your confirmation, the human interrupted, walking away without waiting for a response. The pilot swallowed hard and followed. They moved through a series of corridors, each one just as bare and unwelcoming as the last. But there was something about the way the human walked, something about the way they carried themselves. It wasn't just confidence. It was something deeper. A kind of absolute certainty, as if they had already planned every possible outcome of this meeting. Finally, they reached a door. The human pressed a panel, and it slid open. Inside was a small room, a control station of sorts. Screens lined the walls, displaying data streams, weapon schematics, encrypted communications. But it was the center console that caught the pilot's attention. A single screen, glowing softly, displaying footage of the war. Images of planets burning. Coalition fleets being torn apart. The machine forces advancing without mercy. The pilot turned to the human, unsure how to interpret what they were seeing. How long have you been watching this? The human's voice was quiet. Long enough. Something about their tones sent a chill down the pilot's spine. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even frustration. It was something colder. Calculation. The pilot cleared their throat. The coalition needs your help. They said they'd provide anything you require. The human nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the screen. I already know what I need. Another shiver ran through the pilot. And what is that? The human finally turned to face them, those unreadable eyes locking onto theirs. I need to see the enemy up close. The pilot hesitated. You mean I want to be there? The human interrupted. On the battlefield. Watching them. Learning them. The pilot's breath caught. No strategist, no commander had ever asked for something like that. They always demanded reports, data, fleet movements. But this? That's dangerous, the pilot said, unsure why they were even trying to argue. A flicker of amusement crossed the human's face, brief but undeniable. You call the Deathworlder. The words were simple, but the meaning was clear. The coalition had reached out, desperate for someone who understood war in ways they never could. And now, standing face to face with the kind of mind that thrived in the chaos of battle, they were realizing what that really meant. The pilot exhaled. There was no point in arguing. The decision had already been made. I'll take you to the warfront, they said finally. The human nodded once. Good. Then, just as the pilot turned to leave, the human spoke again. One more thing. The pilot paused. What? When we get there, the human said, voice steady, calm, certain, I don't want to be an observer. The pilot stared. You mean I mean, the human interrupted, stepping forward just slightly. I want to be in the fight. The pilot's heart pounded. This was more than just a request for information. This was something else entirely. And for the first time, standing in that cold, silent station, they finally understood what the grand strategist had meant. They weren't just dealing with a warrior. They had just unleashed something far more terrifying. The journey to the warfront was eerily quiet. The pilot kept glancing at the human, but they never spoke unless necessary. They just sat there, studying every report, every intercepted transmission, every battle analysis. There was an unsettling focus in their eyes, like they weren't just reading the information but absorbing it, breaking it down, seeing the war in ways no one else could. The pilot had ferried many officers before, seen commanders argue over strategies and panic at reports of losses. But this was different. The human didn't react with anger or concern. There was no fear, no hesitation. Only an eerie stillness, like they had already seen every possible outcome. Hours passed before they finally entered the war zone. Wreckage from destroyed ships floated in the vast darkness of space, twisted metal and shattered hulls drifting like silent ghosts. The battle was still raging ahead, flashes of weapons fire lighting up the void. Coalition forces were struggling, their formations breaking apart under the relentless assault of the enemy. The pilot adjusted the controls. We'll land at the forward base. From there, the command team will know. The human's voice was calm, absolute. Take me there. The pilot followed their gaze and felt their stomach twist. The human wasn't pointing at the base. They were pointing at the front lines. Where the battle was at its worst. The pilot hesitated. That's not a place for command. That's a death zone. A small, knowing smile flickered across the human's face. Exactly. The pilot wanted to argue. Wanted to remind them that their mission was to observe, to strategize, not to throw themselves into the fire. But something in the human's gaze made them stop. There was no doubt, no second guessing. They weren't going to the war. They were entering it. With a deep breath, the pilot altered their course. The ship's alarms blared as they approached the battlefield. Fighters zoomed past, streaks of energy fire cutting through the blackness. The coalition forces were being overwhelmed, their ships falling back, desperately trying to hold the line. The moment the ship touched down on the battlefield, the human was already moving. They stepped out into chaos, ground forces locked in brutal combat, explosions shaking the ground, the air thick with smoke and desperation. Coalition soldiers were falling back, struggling to hold their defenses. Then the humans stepped forward. At first, no one noticed them. Soldiers rushed past, focused on their own survival. But then, the human moved, not with panic, not with hesitation, but with purpose. They picked up a discarded weapon, checked its condition in a single glance, and fired. The shot was perfect. Precise. Lethal. A coalition officer nearby turned, eyes widening at the sight of the human calmly taking cover, scanning the battlefield like they had done this 1,000 times before. Who the officer started, but the human was already moving, already calculating. They didn't just fight. They commanded the battlefield, even without speaking. Every movement was efficient, every shot was placed exactly where it needed to be. Coalition soldiers, who had been retreating moments ago, started to notice. Their fear lessened. Their movements steadied. Because for the first time, they weren't just surviving. They were fighting back. The human didn't wait for orders. They pushed forward, weaving through the chaos, identifying weak points in the enemy's line. And when they struck hard. The enemy forces hesitated. That alone was unheard of. They had never hesitated before. They were machines, unstoppable, relentless. But now, they were reacting. Adjusting. Because for the first time, the fight wasn't going the way they expected. The human pressed forward, closing the distance. The enemy tried to counter, but they couldn't predict the way the human moved. The machines operated on logic, on calculations of efficiency. But the human? They fought with something different. Something the machines didn't understand. And that was the problem. Because the moment the enemy didn't understand something, they started losing. Coalition forces, seeing the shift, found their footing again. They weren't just defending anymore. They were pushing. And the more they pushed, the more the enemy faltered. The pilot, still near the landed ship, watched in stunned silence. The battle had been moments from collapse, the coalition forces barely holding on. But now, the tide was turning. The human moved like they had always belonged there. No hesitation. No second guessing. And the enemy, the unstoppable force that had crushed countless worlds, was now struggling. Then, without warning, something changed. A new sound cut through the battlefield. A low, mechanical hum, deep and unsettling. The enemy forces stopped retreating. They reorganized, their movements tightening. And then, the ground trembled. The pilot's blood went cold. Something was coming. Something bigger. The air shifted, filled with an unnatural stillness, as if the battlefield itself was holding its breath. And then through the smoke and fire a massive silhouette emerged. The enemy's true war machine. A towering behemoth of metal and destruction, built to end wars in moments. It moved with terrifying purpose, every step shaking the ground. Energy surged through its limbs, weapons humming to life. Coalition soldiers froze. The confidence they had just regained faltered in an instant. And then, before anyone else could react, the human stepped forward. The pilot's heart pounded. "What are you doing?" they called out, but the human didn't turn back. They just kept walking. The battlefield had gone silent. Even the enemy forces seemed to pause, as if recognizing something different. The war machine locked onto the human. A massive weapon on its arm powered up, energy crackling. And still, the human walked forward. They weren't running. Weren't dodging. They were studying it. The pilot felt their chest tighten. This was madness. No one had ever survived an encounter with one of these things. It was built for extermination. Built to crush any resistance before it had a chance to grow. And yet the human stopped, standing alone before the towering monstrosity. For the first time, the war machine hesitated. A long, heavy silence filled the battlefield. Then the human smiled. And that's when everything changed. The war machine stood motionless, its towering frame humming with barely restrained energy. The battlefield had gone deathly silent, every soldier, both friend and foe, frozen in place, waiting for the inevitable. The human remained still, standing directly in its path, their gaze locked onto the machine's glowing optics. There was no fear in their eyes, only calculation. Then, the war machine moved. Its massive cannon shifted, angling downward, the glow intensifying as it prepared to fire. The charge built up, crackling with unstable energy, enough to vaporize everything in its path. Coalition soldiers braced for the inevitable blast, knowing that nothing could withstand that level of power. But before the shot could be unleashed, the human tilted their head ever so slightly, their lips curling into a small, knowing smirk. And then they spoke. A single word. A command. And the war machine stopped. The glow in its weapon faded. The tremors in the ground ceased. Its hulking frame, once an unstoppable force of destruction, seemed to shudder as if it had just been given an order it didn't know how to process. Whispers rippled through the coalition ranks. No one had ever seen the enemy hesitate, let alone disobey their own programming. The enemy soldiers, who had stood ready to strike, suddenly faltered, their rigid formations loosening. For the first time since the war began, there was uncertainty in their movements. Then, without warning, the war machine did something no one had ever seen before. It took a step back. A murmur of disbelief spread through the ranks. Machines did not retreat. They did not hesitate. They did not fear. The human took another step forward, and the war machine responded with another step back. It was as if an invisible force had suddenly rewritten the rules of the battlefield. But then, something else happened. Something worse. The war machine twitched violently, its metal frame convulsing as if caught in an internal struggle. Sparks shot from its joints, its glowing eyes flickering between their usual piercing red and a dull, confused amber. The human smirk remained, but their eyes sharpened, watching closely. The machine let out a deafening, distorted screech, a sound of pure mechanical agony before its entire body locked up. For a brief moment, the battlefield remained frozen in a perfect, unnatural stillness. And then the war machine exploded. A shockwave ripped through the battlefield, sending soldiers sprawling, the sheer force shaking the very ground beneath them. But the human barely moved, standing firm as if they had already predicted the machine's demise. As the smoke cleared, the wreckage of the once imposing behemoth lay scattered in smoldering ruins. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, as if triggered by the destruction, the remaining enemy forces suddenly turned rigid. Their movements became erratic, their attacks losing precision. Some simply stopped moving altogether, their weapons lowering as if an unseen force had stripped them of their will to fight. The coalition soldiers, stunned by the bizarre turn of events, hesitated for only a moment before realizing the truth. The enemy was breaking down. It wasn't just hesitation. It wasn't just confusion. It was collapse. And the human was at the center of it all. The pilot, still watching from cover, felt a chill run down their spine. This wasn't just strategy. This wasn't just skill. The human had done something to the machines. But before anyone could make sense of the situation, another sound cut through the chaos. A voice. A voice that did not belong to any soldier, human or otherwise. A voice that came from everywhere. You were not supposed to interfere. It wasn't a voice made of flesh and breath. It was cold, mechanical, and filled with something that sounded eerily close to anger. The air seemed to vibrate with the force of it, as if the battlefield itself had become its mouthpiece. The enemy soldiers, those still operational, suddenly froze in place. Their bodies jerked unnaturally, their limbs twitching as if fighting against something unseen. And then, all at once, they turned. Not toward the coalition forces, but toward the human. Every remaining enemy unit now faced them, standing in eerie silence, as if waiting. The human smirk faded, replaced by something else. Not fear. Not worry. But recognition. They had been expecting this. The voice spoke again, the sound sharper this time, carrying a weight that made even the ground tremble. You should not exist. And then, in perfect unison, the enemy forces charged. Not toward the coalition. Not toward the remaining defenses. But toward the human. And this time, it wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The battlefield erupted into chaos as the enemy forces surged forward, moving with a single, terrifying purpose. Their weapons hummed to life, their movements perfectly synchronized, as if guided by something greater than mere programming. They weren't attacking randomly. They weren't advancing on the coalition soldiers. Every single one of them had only one target, the human. Coalition soldiers fired desperately, their weapons tearing through enemy ranks, but it didn't slow them down. The machines ignored the gunfire, their metal limbs sparking with each hit, but they didn't falter. They had been given a new priority, an order that overrode everything else. Destroy the human. But the human didn't move. They stood their ground, watching the machines charge toward them like an unstoppable wave. Their eyes narrowed, not in fear, but in quiet focus. Then, just as the first machine was about to strike, the human raised a single hand. And the machine stopped. It was as if an unseen force had slammed into them mid-charge. Their bodies locked up, their limbs twitching erratically, unable to take another step. The battlefield fell into a tense, unnatural silence, broken only by the crackling energy that rippled through the frozen enemy forces. The human exhaled slowly. There it is, they murmured. The voice returned, echoing through the air, laced with something unmistakable fear. What have you done? The human tilted their heads slightly, eyes still locked onto the frozen machines. You already know. The voice crackled with distortion. You should not exist. You were not meant to be. The human let out a small, almost amused breath. And yet here I am. A deep tremor rippled through the battlefield, as if the very ground was reacting to the exchange. The enemy machines began to shudder violently, their glowing optics flickering between red and dull amber. Some of them collapsed entirely, their bodies twitching uncontrollably. The coalition soldiers, still in shock, could only watch. None of them truly understood what was happening, but one thing was clear: the machines weren't just malfunctioning. They were breaking apart. The voice hissed through the air, filled with a mixture of fury and desperation. This war was never meant to be won by you. The human's expression darkened. That was your mistake. A sharp pulse of energy surged through the battlefield, sending waves of static through the air. The frozen machines convulsed, their bodies jerking wildly as if something inside them was being rewritten against their will. Sparks erupted from their joints. Metal screeched against metal. And then one by one the machines turned on each other. It was chaos. The once unified enemy forces were now tearing themselves apart, weapons firing indiscriminately, their limbs twisting in unnatural angles as if fighting against something unseen. The battlefield, once filled with precise formations and tactical efficiency, had become a storm of destruction. The coalition soldiers could only watch in stunned silence as the enemy crumbled before their eyes. The war that had seemed hopeless, the battle that had pushed them to the brink of defeat, was over in mere moments. But the human remained still. Their expression unreadable. Their gaze focused not on the battlefield, but on something unseen, something far beyond what anyone else could perceive. The voice crackled one last time, its strength fading. This is not the end. The human exhaled, their voice quiet, almost resigned. No. It never is. And then, just like that, the voice was gone. The last remaining enemy machine let out a final, dying word before collapsing into a heap of lifeless metal. The battlefield was silent once more. The coalition soldiers stood there, processing what had just happened. Victory had been snatched from the jaws of certain defeat, but none of them could claim responsibility for it. Only one person had changed the tide. A human. The pilot, still gripping their weapon, took a cautious step forward. What? What did you do? The human finally turned to them, their expression unreadable. I ended it. There was no celebration. No cheers of victory. Only the weight of what had just transpired. And then, as if nothing had happened, the human turned and walked away. No explanations. No grand speeches. Just a lingering question that none of them dared to ask. Because deep down, they already knew. This war had never been about survival. It had been about control. And for the first time in history, humanity had broken free. The battlefield remained eerily silent. The smell of scorched metal and burning circuits hung heavy in the air, mixing with the dust that still swirled from the destruction. Coalition soldiers stood frozen, staring at the wreckage of the enemy forces that had, just moments ago, been on the verge of wiping them out. Now, the war machines lay broken, scattered across the ground like discarded shells, their glowing optics dimmed forever. The human, the one who had ended it all, stood at the center of it. They didn't gloat. They didn't celebrate. Instead, they simply looked at the ruins before them, as if staring at something beyond the physical battlefield. The weight of their own actions pressed down on them, but there was no regret in their posture, only certainty. A few soldiers cautiously approached, keeping their weapons lowered but ready. They wanted answers, but none of them knew how to ask the right question. It wasn't every day that someone single-handedly ended a war with nothing but a few words and an unshakable presence. The pilot, the one who had first called for the humans' help, finally broke the silence. Is it over? The human didn't answer right away. They let the wind carry away the last echoes of the battle before turning their gaze toward the pilot. For now. It wasn't the answer anyone wanted, but it was the truth. The remaining soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. The enemy was gone, wiped out in an instant, but there was no clear victory. They hadn't won by strategy, or firepower, or sheer will. It had been something else. The human had done something to the machines, something no one could explain. And that terrified them. One soldier, younger than the rest, took a hesitant step forward. What were they? They asked quietly. The machines. They weren't just soldiers, were they? The human studied the wreckage one last time before exhaling. No. They weren't. The wind howled softly through the battlefield. No one spoke, waiting for the human to continue. They weren't just machines. They were controlled, the human said finally. Not by programming, not by some remote command. They were part of something bigger. A network. A hive mind. A presence. The pilot frowned. You mean? Like an AI? The humans shook their head. No. Not like any AI you've ever seen. More than that. Something ancient. Something that didn't just want control, it needed it. They looked up at the darkening sky, eyes narrowing. And for the first time, it lost. A chill ran through the group. The idea that there had been something behind the war machines, something unseen and far more powerful, sent an uneasy feeling through everyone. But you stopped it, the pilot said, as if needing to hear it out loud. Didn't. You. The human was quiet for a long moment before giving a slow nod. Yes. I broke its hold. For now. The way they said it made something tighten in the pilot's chest. It wasn't just the words, it was the way the human knew. One of the officers, who had remained silent through most of the battle, finally spoke up. How? Their voice wasn't accusatory, but it was filled with something close to suspicion. How did you do it? The human met their gaze. Because I'm not like you, they said simply. The words hung in the air, heavier than any weapon fired. It was the truth everyone had suspected but hadn't dared to voice. This wasn't just about skill. This wasn't just about experience. The human was different. But no one had the courage to ask what that meant. The human glanced down at the wreckage one last time before taking a slow step away. You should get back to your people, they said. This place won't be safe for long. The pilot hesitated. What about you? The human paused, as if considering their answer. Then, with a small, knowing smile, they said, I have unfinished business. And before anyone could stop them, they walked away. The soldiers watched as the human disappeared into the dust and shadows, their silhouette fading against the ruins of the battlefield. No one tried to follow. No one even spoke. They all knew, deep down, that they had just witnessed something beyond their understanding. The war was over. But the real battle had only just begun. As the coalition forces regrouped and prepared to leave the battlefield, the pilot couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Not just the war. Not just the enemy. Everything. Because somewhere out there, beyond the stars, the presence that had controlled the machines was still watching. Still waiting. And now, it knew that humanity was more than just another species. It knew that somewhere among them, there were people like that. And it would never stop trying to reclaim control. The pilot took one last look at the horizon, where the human had vanished. Then they turned back toward their people. Because whatever was coming next, they would have to be ready. And no matter what,